We're picking up in Isaiah 3 and verse 13. Isaiah 3 verse 13. The Lord has taken his place to contend. He stands to judge peoples. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders and princes of his people. It is you who have devoured the vineyard, the spoil of the poor is your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people, by grinding the face of the poor, declares the Lord God of hosts. The Lord said, because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with outstretched necks, glancing wantonly with their eyes, mincing along as they go, tinkling with their feet, therefore the Lord will strike with a scab the heads of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will lay bare their secret parts. In that day, the Lord will take away the finery of the anklets, the headbands, and the crescents, the pendants, the bracelets, and the scarves, the headdresses, the armlets, the sashes, the perfume boxes, and the amulets, the signet rings, the nose rings, the festal robes, the mantles, the cloaks, the handbags, the mirrors, the linen garments, the turbans, and the veils. Instead of perfume, there'll be rottenness. Instead of a belt, a rope. Instead of well-set hair, baldness. Instead of a rich robe, a skirt of sackcloth. And branding instead of beauty. Your men shall fall by the sword, and your mighty men in battle. And her gates shall lament and mourn. Empty, she shall sit on the ground. And 7 women shall take hold of one man in that day, saying, we will eat our own bread and wear our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our reproach. Let's pray. Father, we pray that as we study this passage, Lord, that you would enable me tonight to teach. By your Spirit, Lord, may you speak to us, illuminate your word, that we might understand, and understanding we might be transformed. Amen. Okay, so last time we started this whole section, which really started in chapter 3 or end of chapter 2 really, dealing with the judgment of the Jewish leaders. It followed on directly from the day of the Lord, that time of tribulation, that period of judgment upon the earth and particularly upon the Jewish people. And now we have this judgment of the leaders that we've been seeing for the first 12 verses. And it ended up, verse 12, my people, infants are their oppressors and women rule over them. O my people, your guides mislead you and they swallowed up the course of your paths. And so the people of Israel, the Jews, were now being ruled by those who were unqualified. They were the infants and were viewed as oppressors because they were ruling so badly and treating them badly. And women had taken places of leadership, which was contextually a shame to the people, and was them taking a position that they weren't allowed to have. And so the people in general sense were being misled and misguided. And all the people have been swallowed up as a result. They have swallowed up the course of your paths. In other words, the direction that you, the people, are going to go in is being determined by your leaders. And that is not a good place. And so in verse 13, as we continue and finish this section hopefully, Yahweh, the Lord, has taken his place to contend. And he stands to judge peoples. And so God now comes to make a judgment. We've heard the accusation against the leadership, and now he is going to judge them, enter into judgment. And it's interesting that he says that he stands to judge. When we have God taking his judgment seat in sight of the world, Psalm 9 verse 5 and Joel 3 speak of him sitting in judgment. But there's other times when God it seemingly is weary with his long suffering, putting up with the Jewish people and their constant rebellion and their sin. And in doing so, he rises from his throne. He stands up in judgment. And we saw that in chapter 2, verse 19. He rises to terrify the earth. Verse 21, again, is the same phrase repeated. And we're going to see it again in chapter 33. But at other places as well, where God will kind of like he's sitting down and he's going, I've had enough of this. And he gets up. And that's going to be important when we come towards the end of this chapter. So, he stands to judge the people. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders and princes of his people. And so we're very clear, part of this context, and now he's saying it clearly, that it is the leadership of Israel, specifically, that he is judging here. And this is what he says to them. It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people, by grinding the face of the poor? And so, firstly, he says it's you who've devoured the vineyard. And again, we've noted already in Isaiah the repetition of these words of eating, of food, that they will devour, feed on the fruit of the land if they're obedient, and if they're not obedient, they will be devoured. And so we've had that language quite a lot in Isaiah already in these first few chapters, and Isaiah continues that theme here by saying that they, the leaders, have devoured. Now this is a shift. Up to this point, if Israel are good, they do the devouring, they do the eating, they have the land of milk and honey and all the blessings that come from being in the land. But if they do evil, if they commit idolatry as they have, then they are going to be devoured by the invading nations, who will, as we've already seen, take their food, take their wealth. And now it's saying that here, in a negative sense, the leadership are doing the devouring. And what that's doing is that's putting the leadership of Israel in the same role as the enemies of Israel. So previously here, we've seen that the enemies of Israel are going to come in and devour Israel. And now what he's saying is, your leaders have already devoured you. And this is a common theme in the Old Testament of the leadership of Israel. It's a theme of the leadership of the last generation, as I think contextually this probably is. It's a theme of the leadership of the generation of Jesus Christ, and it's a theme of the leadership in the Old Testament as well, at the time of the captivity. Ezekiel is the prophet who gives us the most detail about this. He talks about the false shepherds and how they've led the sheep astray, and that's a theme that Jesus then picks up on in great detail in John chapter 10. But anyway, getting distracted there. But the point is that the leaders here are devouring the people. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But notice here that what they're devouring is described here as a vineyard. Now that's something that we're just going to note in passing for now, because it's a theme that he's going to develop very fully in just a couple of weeks' time. So next week we'll do, if you look at chapter 4, it's a very short chapter, literally just a few verses. And we're doing verse 1 today. So there's just this one little tiny section that's upbeat, where we have the promises restated in chapter 4. And then we come to chapter 5 and we have the Song of the Vineyard. The Song of the Vineyard is a really, really important part of Scripture. We're going to take a lot of time over that, because it is the basis for Matthew 21 and the parable there, where you have the vineyard and the tenants there, and you know that he will send his prophets in, and eventually he sends his son. And what Jesus is doing in that parable is he is taking the condemnation of Israel in chapter 5 here, and he's taking that condemnation and he's applying it to his current generation of leadership, but worse still. And it's also something that is foundational to understanding John 15, where Jesus says, I am the vine. And for us to understand that, we need to understand the Song of the Vineyard. So we'll come at that, we'll have a look at that when we get to chapter 5. But for now, I simply want you to note that it is the vineyard they have devoured, and we'll look at the state of the vineyard a little bit later, and we'll come back and refer to this verse at that time. But in devouring the vineyard, what they've done is they've taken their spoil from the poor. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the face of the poor? Guys, I think we've got to be careful here in two different directions. On the one hand, we don't want to... I've got to choose my words so carefully because I don't want to say this wrong. We have to be careful that when we see God's heart for the poor, that we don't, as some people do, automatically presume viewpoints and positions that are political. And some people do. And I think people can have very different viewpoints politically on what should be done with regards to the poor and welfare and what have you. And this is speaking to us as individuals, clearly. But they as leaders obviously had responsibility for the poor under their care as well. So I don't want to go to one extreme where we say, look, we've got to look after the poor and jump to numerous additional conclusions and maybe take that a bit too far. But on the other hand, I do believe that our problem in our circles is actually the other extreme. I think that in the name of not doing that, we can be very, very shoddy about how we consider those who are less well off than ourselves. This is not a political statement. I was talking with some people at lunchtime. I'm not a political person. I'm really not. And I loathe the partisan politics of America more than you can imagine. And you will never have political preaching from this pulpit. It's not the place for any pulpit, and it certainly won't be in mine. I simply want to say to you that many people in our circles align themselves politically in a direction where perhaps they need to look at verses like this, which are repetitive in the Old Testament and repeated also in the New Testament, and just understand the heart that God has for the poor and downtrodden. He really does. And I think at the very least, we need to look at passages like this, and we need to understand that when people in positions of leadership are living in luxury at the expense of the poor, that is a wicked thing that God will not tolerate. That's very clear. It's a wicked thing that God will not tolerate. And so the leaders here have become wealthy at the expense of the poor. And this is again a theme in Ezekiel with the larger judgment of the leadership, where rather than being shepherds whose role is to look after the sheep, to feed the sheep, to make sure the sheep are in good health, to make sure the sheep are okay, they've made it their job to use the sheep for their own benefit. That is the hallmark of leadership. Whether you're talking about governments, whether you're talking about churches, whether you're talking about anything, whether you're talking about leadership in the home, whether you're about leadership anywhere, this is the absolute hallmark of it, is that a good leader is there to serve and bless those whom they are leading. The picture of bad leadership is those who use their position of leadership so that they are better off, they are happier, they are more comfortable, they have their way, they get what they want. That's not what leadership is. It's a shepherding role, and it's a role where the responsibility is to look after those who need looking after. And here in this passage, they have devoured the poor, they have become rich at the expense of the poor, and the whole vineyard has been destroyed as a result. Now, when we come then to verse 16, we shift, and the judgment becomes upon the Jewish women. Judgment of the Jewish women. Now, some people here don't really follow the connection. Most commentators at this point, and I would be in agreement, see a direct link here. And I will turn to a New Testament passage a little bit later that I think will clarify this connection. But just to put a few pieces of the puzzle together in advance as we go into this section, we've seen that because of their sin, God has brought famine and drought upon the land. As a result of that famine and drought, the leaders have all fallen away. They've all left. They've all gone. Now, it's becoming clearer why now, isn't it? The leaders were in leadership for their own benefit. Now, there's nothing to be taken from everybody in a famine, so they've got to go off and make sure that they're all right. That's why they've stepped down. It's not in their best interest, not in their benefit. And so the leaders have gone, and Israel has become pretty much an anarchy, and as a result, people are stepping into positions of leadership that shouldn't be there. And he says, young people, infants, whether literally, children, or whether those who are simply immature, but also women. And so the women have stepped up into a position that wasn't theirs to take. Leadership in the Bible in Old Testament times, and also taught very clearly in New Testament times, that leadership within the church and then within the broader government of Israel in Old Testament times was something that was a role for men and not for women. And so it was, as I said last time, it was a shameful thing for the people to be ruled by a woman. Some people point to Deborah in the book of Judges, and they don't recognize they're not actually making an argument for something that was good, but rather it was something that was shameful, considered shameful. So the women are stepping up into a position that's not theirs. Here in the next section, we have the leaders who are gathering riches, and then when we come to the condemnation of women here, it is condemning them, and amongst the many things that we're going to see in verses 18 to 23 is a list of 21 different items, all of which could be categorized as luxury items. Items that weren't necessary. Now, how does someone who is a public servant, get rich? By exploiting the poor. How do these women have these luxury items? Because they have rich husbands. Most commentators, therefore, make the link between these passages and say that the condemnation of these women is not necessarily of Jewish women in totality. After all, there's been a time of famine. But rather, it is a judgment of the wives of the leaders. So, leaders' wives. So it's only you I'm preaching to tonight, Jen. Preaching to my wife. No, I'm not. But no, it seems that specifically, contextually, because we've always got to wrestle with the context, that this shift to the judgment of the Jewish women, daughters of Zion, seems to specifically be either A, wives of the leaders, or more specifically, women who have themselves become leaders and then taken spoil from the poor as well. So let's go through with that in mind and see what we see. The Lord said, because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with outstretched necks, glancing wantonly with their eyes, mincing along as they go. I never thought I'd see that phrase in the Bible. They are mincing along as they go. Isn't that incredible? ESV. Tinkling with their feet. What is that all about? Well, let's try and break it down. And by the way, there's a lot of disagreement here, so I'm doing the best I can with what is a difficult little passage. But certainly the easy bit is they're haughty, they're proud. They think much of themselves. This has been a theme throughout Isaiah to this point. He's building up, because in chapter 6, when man has lifted himself up, and here woman has lifted herself up, with the lifting up of humankind saying, we are in charge, we do what we like, God is seen in the vision in Isaiah 6, and he is what? He is high and lifted up. And we see this thing where man is trying to take the place of God and lift himself up, exalt himself, and God is lifted up and man is brought low. And so, God, who has risen up in judgment, is talking about the women who have lifted themselves up. They're haughty, they think much of themselves, and that is seen in how they walk with their, let's get this right, their outstretched necks, literally extended throats. Kind of like that, your throat forward, you know. It would be the equivalent of us saying, with your nose in the air. That's how we would say it probably today, unless that's an English thing and not an American thing. But, you know, someone walking around with their nose in the air, look at them, fancy that, look at them with their lesser nose rings. Only got silver ones, not gold. That kind of haughty, look at me, I'm so wonderful, I'm so wealthy, I have so much, I'm so important, and walking around in that kind of attitude. And the expression also speaks of them liking their appearance. And that's something that becomes clearer, I think, as you go down and see the list of all the luxury items, which are predominantly items that you wear. And so they are trusting to a degree in their beauty. Their beauty has got them to the place that they are, whether it's in leadership, whether it's the wife of a leader, it's their beauty, their external beauty, perhaps I should say, that has got them to that place. And that goes hand in hand, with them glancing wantonly with their eyes. If this was men we were talking about, you'd probably translate this as ogling or leering or something like that. But the idea is that they see what they desire. They want their riches, they want the man in leadership, they want the position, they want the authority, they want the respect, and they're walking around thinking that that's theirs by right, and glancing at the things that they want, mincing as they go, tinkling with their feet. That expression, the best I can understand it, those expressions talk perhaps of them sort of tripping a little bit as they go. In other words, they're so focused on what they're going to get, what they deserve, and their greed, that is their focus, that they can't even walk along as they go. They're too distracted. And that's how I best understand that difficult phrase there. So this is the position of God regarding them. Therefore, verse 17, the Lord will strike with a scab the heads of the daughters of Zion. And that is a statement as to they have trusted in external beauty, and so what judgment is going to come? The judgment that's going to come is going to take away that beauty that they've trusted in. There'll be a scab upon their heads. That's what that is referring to. And the Lord will lay bare their secret parts. Secret parts, if you have that in your translation, is simply a euphemism for nakedness. So secret parts would be maybe an expression you'd use with a 6-year-old in your house, don't look, I'm getting changed, don't look at my secret parts, or something like that. It's a kind of a polite euphemism, but it's basically what it means is God is going to lay bare their nakedness. And there is going to be this shaming of them. And we're going to see that very practically when the judgment comes and they're taken away. I don't know how to say this without being too specific, but when beautiful women were being taken at a time of war by vicious heathen warmongers, let's just say things didn't end up very nice for them. And that may well explain the laying bare of their secret parts. Verse 18, in that day the Lord will take away. And I think that just, I mentioned this briefly in passing, this just clarifies the context of timing. This is the final judgment. This is the final, but this is the period of tribulation, as we call it. This is the period when God is going to judge Israel for that period that by the time we get to a little bit later on in the scripture, we discover is a period of 7 years. And it's in that day, the day of the Lord, that's been referenced previously in our last passage. In that day, the Lord will take away the finery of their anklets, their headbands, and the crescents. So just before we come into this, I think the judgment is very much, This is when it's going to be taken away. This stuff will be taken away. This judgment will come in the day of the Lord. But it's clever in the way that it's worded. He's speaking to the current people. So the situation that they were in, the women were guilty of this, but the ultimate judgment of those women is going to be done to another generation, because it clearly says in that day. And I do think that's a reference to the day of the Lord contextually. But whether it's something that's going to happen to these ones specifically with their coming judgment, or whether it's only the end times, whether it's both, either way, the judgment for these women will be the removal. And I've read through them, I'm not going to read through them again. There's 21 items there. They are items that all speak of luxury, and they are pretty much all external and to do with beauty and external beauty as well. And what's going to happen in verse 24 with the removal of this is that there will be a removal and a replacement. Instead of perfume, there will be rottenness. Literally, instead of spice, there will be moldiness. So you have this sweet-smelling spice, and obviously perfume in those days wasn't like, you didn't go to a store and buy yourself a nice little one with whoever the latest teeny bopper is with her name signed on something that a few old men in white coats in a lab had put together, and they go, it's not like that. It was concocted from specific spices for their smells and what have you. And you'd have this nice spicy smell that would be used as perfume, and now it's, if you imagine, rotten, moldy food. Have you ever had that time when there's been a piece of food, whether in a fruit bowl or a fridge, and you've checked it and you think you've cleaned it all out, but there's just something that smells awful and you can't find it. And finally you open up that tub of whatever dairy product it is and realize that it was something that should have been cleaned out last year, and you open it up and that's the idea. So the idea is that these women, through this time of judgment, are going to be brought to a place where there's no more money for spices to smell nice, and they're just going to be smelling horrible. Instead of a belt, rope, literally belt, girdle. Belt is not exactly really what it is, but it's doing a similar purpose. It's holding clothes up. But instead of that, rope. And the reference to rope here is because, in a sense, the girdle is a kind of rope, The point here is, rather than having bits of rope or string to hold your clothes up so you look nice, instead of that, what you're going to have is you're going to have ropes that will tie you up because you're going to be imprisoned and in captivity. Instead of well-set hair, baldness. And Scripture often talks about the women's hair in good terms, the glory of a woman and what have you, and her hair's going to be gone. Whether it's cut off as a judgment or whether it falls out with sickness, we don't know, but baldness will come. Instead of a rich robe, a skirt of sackcloth, rather than a celebratory garment, one of mourning. And then this last one is particularly horrific. Branding instead of beauty. The picture there is simply this. Everything that was upon them was to make them look nice, to make them look good, to trust in that beauty, external beauty that was going to let them get what they want and be in control and have power. Guys know that, don't we? That sometimes, when a woman, guys will talk in terms, I know I have friends talk in terms about the power of a woman because of using her external beauty. And now, what's going to be marking them on the outside? None of those items anymore, but branding. They are going to be taken by captors, and like cattle, they will be branded. They are now a possession. How different their life has become. And really, all of that is bad enough, but in a contextual sense, in the sense of the era that we're dealing with, and how they would have seen these things. The last judgment is perhaps the worst one of all. The last one is perhaps the worst one of all. I'm going to read to you, you don't have to turn there, just a little bit later on in Isaiah. In Isaiah 54 and verse 4, which is a more upbeat passage, it says, "Fear not, you will not be ashamed. Be not confounded, for you will not be disgraced. You will forget the shame of your youth. The reproach of your widowhood you will remember no more." In that culture, for a woman to be unmarried was very, very different than our culture. And whether the woman had never become married at all, whether she had become single through widowhood or divorce, that a single woman really was a place of shame for many. It's interesting that Isaiah 54 is talking about a period of restoration, when after this time of judgment, there will come a time when women will be told, you won't remember that anymore. Things will be so good that that time, it'll be like, won't even be a memory anymore. That reproach will be gone. But we need to understand that, just for context, to understand that in verse 25, when he says, your men shall fall by the sword, your mighty men in battle, it's basically saying, hey, you've got these important, powerful leaders, mighty men who are yours, and then of course there's this judgment coming in, and they're going to fall by the sword, and then what do you have? You're going to lose them. And her gates shall lament and mourn, empty she shall sit on the ground. And there will be lots of dead men through battle, which will leave lots of judged, sad, poor women. And specifically, and ignore the chapter break here, it was chapter breaks in the Bible are the work of man and they're not inspired. And the new section is verse 2 of chapter 4. This finishes off our current section in verse 1. 7 women shall take hold of one man in that day, saying, we will eat our own bread and wear our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name and take away our reproach. What's going on there is this. In Exodus chapter 21 and verse 10, the very minimum that any man had to do for his wife was to provide food and clothing. To provide food and clothing. And even to this day, for us guys, when that's a struggle to do, it's a reproach. And therefore, these women are now in their own reproach because they're single now. They aren't married. And in coming to be married, they will have their food provided for and they'd have their clothes provided for. But they're like, forget it. It's a time of famine. You don't worry about getting me food. You just worry about your own food. I'll worry about my own food. I'll get my own clothes. Pardon me, my own clothes. I just want to be married. I just want to get rid of the shame. I just want that reproach gone. But the problem is that for every 7 women, there's 1 man. Now, I am very firmly a pre-tribulationist. I do believe that Christ will come for his church before this period of tribulation. A lot of guys have said in the past, maybe we should be post-tribulational. 7-1, that's a good ratio. Not a good idea. Not a good time. They're scabby, smelly women. You don't want that ratio even then. Just kidding. But yeah, 7-1 ratio. So these women are going to be left in this place of reproach where they don't want even the most basic rights that they would have as wives. And so when we put all of this together, there seems to be this situation where haughty women who are proud in their appearance, are proud in their wealth that they have either directly or through their husbands more likely, are so proud that they would take positions of leadership that they weren't allowed to have. And God is going to bring judgment on them. And it is very interesting that this follows immediately after the passage where the leaders have been condemned for robbing the poor. And it's almost like there is this, what's their names? The famous robbers, 1 man, 1 woman. Somebody help me out. Bonnie and Clyde, thank you. It's like a Bonnie and Clyde effect. American history, I'm not so good at that. Bonnie and Clyde effect, where you've got the guy who's robbing for the woman, and there's this, she wants this and she wants this position, and he wants this beautiful wife with all of these things, and they're financing it through the abuse of his position of leadership, or from her taking a position of leadership. Now, that is the judgment that's coming then to the leaders. It's the judgment that's coming to the women, the wives, I think, of the leaders. And fortunately, in verse 2 of chapter 4, there is a reminder of the promises of God, and we're going to be there next time. But before we finish, I do want us to turn briefly to 1 Peter 3. First Peter 3. And none of the commentaries I read took me to this place. But it did strike me as I was reading through that list, it very much reminded me of 1 Peter 3, where it talks about the adorning and the external. So let's look at it briefly. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands. Now, this is a section where it's talking of the typical household codes. Paul has household codes in Ephesians and Colossians, where you have the different groups that make up a household. Specifically, the role for wives, the role for husbands, the role for children, and the role for slaves, which is a very awkward translation, because in this country you think of the slavery that you've had here historically, and it wasn't that thing at all. It was actually a lot closer to perhaps military service, closer to maybe employment, closer to even part of the welfare state, in that the slavery was a way of dealing with those who couldn't provide for themselves and giving them an opportunity to provide for themselves. So it really wasn't, you've got to get the idea of more recent slavery out of your head, for the main part anyway. But in this section, it's talking specifically to those same groups of people and telling them essentially this: when the other people in the household aren't doing their job well, you've still got to do yours well. You don't get to opt out because somebody else is opted out. That's the deal here. So having said that, with regards to slaves, slaves, if your masters suck and if they treat you badly, just keep being a good slave, right? That's what he's saying. Likewise, in the same way, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. I was very tentative about turning to this passage, because it's one of the least favourite passages for this generation in the Bible, because it goes totally against the flow of our society. I think we need to be careful not to take this out of its context and give too much weight to it, allowing for some social context here, but at the same point we mustn't water it down because of our social context. I think what is clear from here and elsewhere is that the wives should submit to their husbands. Paul says in Ephesians to submit to them in everything as unto the Lord. And here is this broader picture of wives having this place of... there's so many words that are laden with negativity that I need to choose my words carefully. But there is humility. There is a humility within the woman that is considered the thing to be valued in this text. Now, I think the biggest problem our society has with the concept of submission, the concept of humility, is the same thing. People don't like submission today because we're proud. Just in the same way we don't like humility. The idea that somebody else tells us what to do or what have you, we just don't like that. And that's ultimately pride, because every one of us has to be submissive. We have to be submissive to the authorities in government above us, and we have to be submissive to God, always, in everything. All of us are going to have to submit in ways that we don't want to submit. So it's the same for us all in that regard. The picture here is that if a wife has a husband that basically is a lousy husband, let's just be frank. He's just not doing his job properly in a spiritual sense. The phrase used here is does not obey the word. That's a nice blanket phrase, because it certainly would include unbelievers, but also it could certainly apply to all of us who are believers at certain points in our time. Unless any of you here guys are always obedient to the Bible in every regard, because if you are, I'd like to meet you and know how you do it. But there is this sense in which it's more of a blanket covering. And when that is the case, when a husband's not obeying the word, then the idea is that the wives, rather than taking authority and saying, well, you shouldn't be doing it this way and what have you, that she wins him without a word. And this is where I want to be careful not to... the idea that the woman should be this kind of, not say anything. It's just nonsensical. I don't think that's what's being said here. It's talking specifically about how to win the husband. It's not saying, I say almost in a sense the opposite. I think a woman, if her husband is in sin, has a responsibility to tell him he's in sin. Because he's your brother in Christ. And the scripture is very clear on what you do when your brother's in sin, or when someone sins against you. You go to them and you present that sin. So of course you should do that. I think what it's saying is that the way to bring about change, the way to behave, the way to deal in that situation, and we're getting to the point in a minute, by the way, I'm just giving you the context. The way to deal with that situation is not to tell them how wrong they are and trying to convince them, but to keep on doing what you're supposed to do. In other words, don't let your words be the thing that win him over. Let your behavior be the thing that wins him over. And what they need to dress themselves with, if you want to use a phrase to get the concept that's being communicated here, is respectful and pure conduct. In other words, the picture that we've seen of these women in Isaiah 3 is really the opposite of what a woman should be. And what he's saying here is he's saying, look, if you want to dress yourself and be beautiful, don't do it by don't let the adorning be external, the braiding of hair, the putting on gold jewelry, the clothing that you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. We are in an era where women are being taught from a very young age that, anything a man does, you should be able to do. To say that there's a difference between the sexes is sexist and it's wrong and you're being suppressed and all of this kind of stuff. But, in a sense, it's a position of privilege. What have we seen the whole way through Isaiah so far? Those who humble themselves, God lifts up. Those who lift themselves up, God humbles. Constantly. So for a woman to be given a place that is one of a gentle and quiet spirit, where one of submission, that is a place that places her closer to the heart of God. Because that's what God loves. She's a model of what we all should be before God. In the relationship, husband and wife, the man is fulfilling the role of Christ in the picture. The woman is fulfilling the role of the church. And ideally, the spotless bride, the redeemed bride of Revelation 19. And so in doing so, when she behaves correctly, when she has this gentle, quiet, submissive spirit, what she's doing is she is a model to her husband of how he should behave before God. But I think that there is absolutely no way in my mind that Peter wrote 1 Peter 3 without half of his brain being in Isaiah 3. Because it's exactly the same situation. We have women who are proud, haughty, lifting themselves up, saying, look at me, look at my external beauty. And that's their wealth, as it were. And robbing the poor to finance that. And Paul says, look, even if you're in a position where you're being maltreated, you don't want to be that kind of person. You don't want to be that kind of person. And so he specifically says that the dressing should be one that is an internal rather than external thing. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed to Abraham, calling him Lord. No, you don't have to say that. That's a contextual, social thing. But, the concept of submission, that is how they showed their hope in God, by doing that. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that's frightening. It's very frightening when you've got to keep doing good and the one in the home isn't doing good. And for a woman to have a husband who isn't loving and isn't obeying the word, it's a very scary thing. It's a very, sometimes it's very serious. And his advice, his counsel is to internally dress oneself correctly. Have the right character and spirit that communicates the character of God. Show your husband what godly Christianity looks like. You show him in your behavior how he should behave before God. That's how you win without a word, because you're modeling the behavior to him as your leader that he should be modeling towards God, his leader, in submitting to his word. And does that mean that women shouldn't adorn themselves with, banning jewelry or something like that? No. It's simply saying this. It says, don't trust in your external beauty. I remember one preacher always used to use the expression in this context of, if the barn door needs painting, you paint the barn door, with regards to external adornment, makeup and jewelry and what have you, And I certainly don't think that there's any problem with that at all. But just don't trust in it. Don't trust in it. Don't use it. Don't be manipulative with it. And what's happened here is that just as in 1 Peter 3, and by the way, the next verse, which isn't really the context of what we're doing in Isaiah, but to be fair, we should look at it as well. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. The likewise there is putting the same context. When your wife isn't obedient to the word, when your wife isn't submitting, you also have to do your job, and you need to understand, you need to dwell with understanding. You need to, rather than say, well, this behavior is wrong, you've got to say, well, why is she behaving this way? How can I help? Well, because of the husband, it's not without a word. So there are things that could perhaps be said and done, but there has to be that same place of giving honor to the woman, the weaker vessel, since they're heirs with you in grace, so your prayers may not be hindered. There is that place where you keep honoring, you keep loving, even if you're the only one doing your job. So that's the balance. But in 1 Peter 3 and in Isaiah 3, we have the same thing. We have, similar thing. In Isaiah, we have the condemnation of the women. In 1 Peter 3, we have the warning to the women not to come into a place where they might get condemnation. But in both places, there is this warning of not rising up, of having that quiet, humble spirit, of which submission is the ultimate expression of that. And in doing so, that is not something that is unique to women. Yeah, I'm not saying that, husbands submit to their wives. There is a distinction biblically, spiritually. But what I'm saying is that the meek, submissive wife is this model to her husband. And that's where I think so many people reject submission as a concept, because they're not rejecting the biblical model, they're rejecting a cultural model that they may have picked up. Certain regions of America are very much like that still, far worse other places of the world, where the woman is supposed to be this meek, gentle person, and the husband gets to say, yeah, I'm in charge, yeah, let's do what we want, let's go out and have fun and do this and what have you, where his position of leadership is one of sucking dry. And that's not the biblical model at all. That in fact, that quiet, submissive spirit that she has before him is one that he needs to model and have before God. And when he does that, then he's going to use his position of leadership to shepherd his wife, to love his wife, to feed his wife, to shower his wife with blessings rather than to rob her and make her poor. But just as for the wife, the beauty should not be external but internal, so for the husband, the showering of blessings upon the wife should not be what we see in Isaiah 3. Remember who the judgment was for the main part? It was for the leaders. They were the ones who were robbing to give the wives what they wanted. And it's not loving as husbands to just, create a situation where the wife is able to be like that. We want to, husbands and wives, work together to make each other more Christ-like. In the same way we spoke this morning about the communal, the congregational aspect of maturity and how we as a church minister to one another. Well, within the home, we have that in a microcosm where we can encourage one another to grow, pray for one another, show grace to one another. I think sometimes in the home, particularly parents and children, it's an easy environment to get good at the biblical gift of rebuking. Is it not? Our children give us ample opportunities to rebuke them and to correct them and to teach them in that regard. But don't they equally give us opportunities to model grace, forgiveness, and love? And so it is that there is this opportunity. And I do think that, just turning back to Isaiah 3 to finish, the whole of this section of Isaiah 3 is a reminder to all who would ever seek a place of leadership. James warns us, it's a good thing if you want to be a teacher, but there's a heavy responsibility that comes with it. A heavy responsibility. My advice to anybody, having been a pastor for 2 decades now, is if you desire to be a pastor, to be a teacher, if there is absolutely anything else in life that you can do, anything else, do it. And I mean that without any jest or irony or making a gag. If it's something else that you could just go off and be happy and do that in life, go do it. But for those that God calls, they can't. They can't walk away. Jeremiah spoke of this. He was preaching God's word. And he spoke words of judgment that was to come. No one wants to hear judgment. Play us a happy song, Jeremiah, was essentially what they were saying. And Jeremiah preached a message of judgment. So the leader of that region put him in the stocks overnight. They said, well, that'll shut him up. We'll put him in the stocks. And so Jeremiah overnight was left out in the public area, in the stocks, as a punishment. And the next morning he's let out. And they're like, oh, that'll shut him up. And he preaches all the louder and brings not just judgment to the people in general, but brings specific judgment to the leader who put him in the stocks, and to him and his family. Not because Jeremiah was vengeful, but because God gave him the message to tell. You tell this guy that he and his family, they're done. This is what's going to happen to them. And what's fascinating about Jeremiah is, unlike Isaiah, where we just see the word that he gives, with Jeremiah we see behind the scenes as well. And Jeremiah turns around and he says to God, and I'm paraphrasing very loosely here, you conned me. When you called me, I had no idea that it would be like this. But then he says, but you put a fire in me, an unquenchable fire that burns, and I cannot stay silent. They're the only people that should lead. This whole passage is about leaders who are leading for their benefit, for their blessing. To make themselves rich and make themselves wealthy. You want to see people like that? You can turn on TBN any day of the week, and it's full of them. With their cars and their jets and their everything. And the people who are poor are there giving their money, giving their funds, and giving to finance the luxurious and exorbitant lifestyle of false teachers. And I often ask this question to people, and people don't often get it right, but where do these ministries geographically have their greatest success? And the answer is Africa. When you get poor people, then the promise of have faith in God and you'll be wealthy is a very powerful tool. And so they literally fly to Africa in their private jets, do rallies, take what little the poor people have, make an absolute killing because there's so many of them, and then fly back again to their mansions. There shouldn't be such leaders. Leadership is then taken away and given to those who are children. I referenced the other week Stephen Furtick firing water pistols mid-sermon to his congregation. Clowns entertaining on stage. The job of leadership is to be faithful to the Word of God. Simply to, as I always say to you guys, to teach the text, the whole text, and nothing but the text. So help me God. That's what we try and do here. So it's a warning to us all. It's a warning to us all. We've seen the judgment of Israel as a whole, to Judah as a whole, and now we've seen specifically the greater judgment to the leadership. Fortunately, after your patience going through judgment after judgment after judgment, we have another breather, where next week we'll be in chapter 4 and verse 2, and we will have a look at what happens again at the end of that period of judgment. But that's for next time. Let's pray now, and We'll close our meeting. Father, we thank you for your word. Isaiah's never easy, just these judgments that come against Israel, and when we see their sins, we see ourselves. The desire to be in charge, the desire to be lifted up, to be recognized, to be haughty, desire to be beautiful, to be admired. And then right there at the end, those women, when their husbands were killed, were sitting down at the gates. You rose up in judgment, and they were sitting down. You were lifted up, and you made them bow low. Father, may we willingly bow low, that one day you might lift us up. Whoever we are, husbands, wives, single, whatever. Humility and submission is for us all. To be submissive before you and your word, to treat others humbly and gently, to give additional grace and love to those who struggle, the poor in flesh, the poor in spirit. Lord, may we not lift ourselves up, that you would humble us, but may we come to you in humility. And Lord, may your name be lifted up above all. Amen. Amen.